and thank you to Hedayah for hosting this conference and for inviting me to speak. I'm going to be presenting research on childhood offending under the Terrorism Act in the UK. This is research that I conducted external to ISD, published at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation with my former colleague Gina Vale, now at the University of Southampton. Gina's also here today. I won't make you wave, Gina, but please do approach her as well to talk about this research. I will start by echoing my co-panelists in saying that this research really came about due to a significant lack of robust evidence when it comes to our understanding of children's involvement in terrorist spaces, and therefore decision-making which was often reliant on assumptions rather than data-driven. Of course, this is very much an opaque space due to the necessary protections of children's data. However, we often discovered that that data simply didn't exist even in closed spaces. And so really from the start, this was an attempt to try and, within ethical guidelines, understand and publish this data so that it can inform policymaking. This has been a 3 to 4 year project now of building a publicly available data set of children convicted under the Terrorism Act in the UK. So our inclusion criteria are threefold. Children who've been successfully convicted, so if the case was acquitted, then have not been included, under the Terrorism Act and subsequent related legislation, and of children at the time of offence. So this slightly relates to the Home Office data, which is the most published data that is available on this, but that is not disaggregated when it is publicly available. So we really sought to understand the colour behind these cases. Who were these children? How did they get involved? How does the system in the UK understand a child terrorist offender? What factors might impact their agency, accountability and threat landscape in the UK? I'll spin through this very quickly and then I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. So here's our overview of the data. This is updated as of yesterday, I believe, but there's a lot of ongoing cases as well. We have 51 children convicted of terrorism offences since 2016. That's 50 boys and 1 girl. You can see from the graph on the left that the most common type of offence was related to extreme right-wing ideology. Around a third were related to Islamist, and we have 2 cases which we've called unknown or other. Unknown simply because that wasn't published, and other where it was unclear what the motivation was. I should say that our method for collecting all this was publicly available open source data through legal repositories such as Bailey law pages, through public CPS records, through sentencing remarks where they're available, but they're not often available, I should say, and when in doubt through trusty Google alerts as well. Given that many of these cases are publicly of interest and so are often reported on. You can see on the bottom right the age range of the children at first offence. Many of them committed several offences. You can see the range for extreme right-wing children goes quite a bit younger, to 13, and for most of these children, they're in the 15 to 17-year-old bracket here. But some of these are really very young at the age of first offence. This is our graph of offences over time. It broadly consists of 2 waves, although that is becoming ever more complicated. The first wave in pink, I hope you can see that, is of Islamist-related offences. So children who attempted to travel to Syria, who were motivated by IS-linked ideologies or Al-Qaeda, perhaps who planned attacks in the UK when they were unable to travel to Syria. This next wave in the grey is the extreme right-wing wave which came through after the banning of national action in 2016. This third wave, far-right, extreme right networks of Feuerkrieg and Sonnenkrieg division, and the decentralisation of a lot of these movements as well, led to quite a significant spike, particularly during the COVID pandemic, as you can see. And we have the re-emergence of some Islamist-related cases, 2 children who tried to travel to Afghanistan, and a number of cases that are still going through the courts at the moment, potentially related to Islamist ideology as well. We've broken these cases down here by type of offence. You can see the most common form of offence was collection of information or dissemination of terrorist publications. So children who on social media platforms very often downloaded terrorist materials, operational information, and disseminated it to their peers. There's also a number of children who created their own terrorist publications independently of any adults, steeped in very strong aesthetic movements, often very violent and extremely racist, and were able to recruit other children into their movements based off this. So there's a couple of recent examples which you may well have heard about, the most prominent being a child up in Derbyshire who created quite a significant cache of propaganda. A screenshot of one of those videos became the front page of the Buffalo Shooters manifesto. You can see the third most common type of offence was preparation of terrorist acts. I'll go into this a bit more in a second. I would love to be able to break these all down. I don't quite have the time, but in the report you can see them in more detail. We have non-tact offences. We've included that here because a lot of children were convicted of offences at the same time as terrorism offences, broadly hate crimes, collection of weapons, and in some cases sexual offences, which may be well related to the same ideologies which drove extreme right-wing engagement in some cases as well. There's also the encouragement of terrorism. All of these cases took place on social media, and a small number of cases for supporting or membership of a prescribed organisation. That's quite a clear and probably not a surprising finding here, that a lot of children are not involved in formal groups, particularly on the far right, where those are less relevant to terrorist mobilisations nowadays, but rather are involved in online networks which aren't necessarily top-down or group-centric, but still involve the same engagement and radicalisation pathways that groups perhaps used to. I'll include sentence length here because of this very clear statistic, which you can see that the vast majority of extreme right-wing offenders did not receive custodial sentences, whereas on the Islamist side, the most common sentence length was 3 to 5 years. There might be a number of reasons for this. In some cases, the severity of offence for extreme right-wing individuals was on the less severe side, so more related to collection or dissemination of information rather than planning attacks. It could be to the younger age, generally, of extreme right-wing individuals who would have had stronger sentencing mitigations at 13, 14. Often, we found that extreme right-wing children entered a guilty plea, which would have counted as a mitigation, whereas often there was a more mixed picture among the Islamist-related children. And perhaps we need to consider what additional factors might be involved and which may impact sentencing between extreme right-wing and Islamist individuals. I've included this just to delve into one of these offences of those convicted of attack planning. There were 7 children who planned to travel to Syria, Afghanistan, or Libya, to Afghanistan, most commonly Syria, and had made quite significant preparations. Some of them had gone paintballing, for example, to prepare for what they perceived to be this kind of glorified war which they were going to travel to. They'd collected quite significant tactical equipment in some cases, and were being guided as to how to purchase plane fares and to travel to these cases. 9 children were convicted of planning attacks in the UK. There's some significant cases of a Justin Bieber concert in Cardiff. You can see on the bottom right, there's a propaganda image created by that young individual, a Isle of Wight festival case earlier this year, and local government buildings. You can see on the top right here, this is a manifesto written into a school notebook, which is, for me, quite a stark and difficult image to look at. There's a number of these cases of children who had made very violent imagery in these kind of more child-perceived areas. These extreme right-wing offenders often had quite significant online footprints, handwritten manifestos, online manifestos, were often talking to each other and able to recruit each other, unrelated to adults. Some of them had also started printing 3D printed weapons as well. So in this case, we can see that although the children might not have understood what they were doing, or might not have quite had the capacity to understand how they were being manipulated, they were able to conduct and plan quite significant attacks, which were very close to posing severe harm. And we've seen actually over the last year a number of cases of children who've committed attacks across the world, in Australia, in Switzerland as well. A brief note about the online space here, I would be remiss to not include it. When children have increased vulnerabilities, which is quite well understood, social media provides the opportunity for the exploitation of these vulnerabilities. We found 30 children were convicted of collecting information and 23 for dissemination, including creating their own propaganda. So children are capable of this innovation and amplification and able to recruit their peers, regardless of whether they understood that that's what they were doing. When looking through a lot of these sentencing remarks, a lot of children, particularly on the extreme right wing, would say, I didn't understand what I was doing, I was just trying to fit in, I was just trying to look cool, whereas perhaps previously to social media, there may have been a different way of expressing those vulnerabilities. Nowadays, it's very easy to go online, even for children, and to access very harmful information. You can see one example here from the recent Taylor Swift concert in Vienna that was cancelled because of an attack planned by children. At ISG, we found fairly easily after the attack 56 pieces of terrorist content available to sock puppet minor accounts, and a lot of this was content recommended to children by platform recommender algorithms. So perhaps even where children aren't actively seeking out this information, the easily accessible nature of graphic, violent and harmful content on social media leads to their exploitation of these vulnerabilities by children. And I know this is something the Online Safety Act is seeking to address with its codes of practice for children, which I believe are coming in mid-next year. So just a quick note on response strategies. This is a paper that myself and my colleague Milo Comerford published earlier this year on a comprehensive UK counter-extremism policy. We've seen in this presentation that children are both victims of the exploitation of their vulnerabilities and perpetrators in equal right. That's quite a difficult thing sometimes for the criminal justice system to come to terms with. And we found that in many of these cases, adult-centric CT approaches have been simply transplanted onto children when they were not built for those purposes. And children have really struggled in this system in many of these cases. These new drivers and engagement pathways point not to the securitization of children and these risk factors, but to safeguarding-led approaches. How can we look at upstream prevention mechanisms which support children rather than try to securitize these vulnerabilities? This all sits in this hybridized post-organizational extremist landscape where children are able to access all forms of online harm, school shooter fandoms, for example, and even where they're not ideological, perhaps it's the same processes at play for exploiting their vulnerabilities. And, of course, a lot of this comes down to digital regulation. At the heart, children should not be able to access illegal and very graphic and very violent content on social media. This is something which the OSA should address. However, on top of this, we have these offline drivers, the mainstream form of hate and extremism, which children are increasingly exposed to, and these diverse engagement pathways, which we need to be additionally thinking about beyond the OSA. How do we look at protecting and safeguarding children? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.